Very good. Let's get started here then. All right, everybody. Welcome online to the Department of Forestry's Hanover seminar series. And we'll be doing this semester by Zoom. And I have a few protocol remarks before we get started. The first is that it's going to be recorded and then posted online. So for those of you who so desire, you can turn your video off and it won't be included in the recording. Also, we'll field questions through the use of the chat system. So if you open your chat box and put a question in there, then our speaker, when he's finished with his presentation, will use the chat box to answer your questions. Okay, so I'm your host today. I'm David Skoll. I'm a professor in the Department of Forestry here. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Jesse Abrams, who is an assistant professor of natural resource policy and sustainability at the Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Resources at the University of Georgia. He's also affiliated with the famous Savannah River Ecology Laboratory there. He received his master's and his PhD from Oregon State University and his undergraduate bachelor's degree in environmental studies from New College of Florida. He's previously held positions with the Ecosystem Workforce Program at the University of Oregon and at Whitman College. Most of his research focuses on questions related to policy and governance of forests and rangelands across North America. And today he's going to provide a presentation entitled Systems Thinking for Understanding U.S. National Forest Governance Dynamics. So without further ado, I'm going to turn that over to you, Jesse, if you can just share the screen. And I would encourage, I would recommend that viewers go to speaker view mode because that will reduce the clutter on your own screen.
All righty. Thanks so much, David. Appreciate that introduction. Hi, everyone. I lament not being able to be there in person and meet you all, but it's good to be able to continue these sorts of lectures even in the current situation. So yeah, I'll be talking about this idea of systems thinking and national forest governance dynamics, kind of drawing on some of my own research and associated researchers in the field. Let's see if I can get this working here. So the general outline here, I'll start with a very short kind of capsule history of the National Forest System and the U.S. Forest Service, and then talk about some of the kind of predominant prevailing approaches to studying national forest governance, before going into some insights around this notion of systems thinking and what it might contribute to our studies of forest governance. And I'll spend a decent amount of time providing an example from some recent research that I've been involved in from the Western US, looking at responses to the mountain pine beetle outbreak of recent years. And then I'll close with some implications for research and practice. And of course, leave time at the end for questions and discussion. So as David said, well, it sounds like we'll use the chat box for that. So to start, I'm going to assume that folks are already relatively familiar with the story of the national forests in the U.S. As you can see here on the map, the green sort of outlines are the national forests, obviously predominantly located in the West, and that has to do with the history of the public land system and the public domain, and from which most of our national forests were reserved from disposal to private hands. But as you can see, quite a bit of land in the East as well, owned by the federal government and manages national forests, and those primarily purchased by the federal government under the authorities of the Weeks Act and subsequent legislation. So essentially, the idea here is that this was an estate put together by the federal government to prevent the denigration or the diminishment of natural resources that were of national importance. And so the idea here was that kind of around the late 19th century, early 20th century, forests were being widely degraded on private lands. And so this was essentially a progressive era government response to own these lands, keep them in federal ownership, and manage them according to scientific principles. So if we do kind of a very quick capsule history of the Forest Service, we might break it into these different periods here, starting with what you'd call the custodial period for the first several decades, where kind of competition from private timber kept a lot of the public timber off the market. And so there was a sense that the Forest Service was sort of doing some planning, some fire suppression, laying out lookouts and roads and things, but not doing a lot of timber management. That changed after World War II and what's sometimes called the sustained yield period, where the focus was really on maximizing the output of timber resources from these lands. Obviously, we had this sort of environmental era starting in around 1970. A lot of, almost all of our bedrock environmental legislation passed from essentially the late 1960s through the 1970s, leading to what you might think of as the rational planning era of the U.S. Forest Service, guided by laws such as NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, and NIFMA, the National Forest Management Act. Some of those laws really didn't show their full potential and influence for another couple of decades. And particularly if you know the story of the timber wars, the spotted owl wars in the Pacific Northwest, that kind of led to another paradigm change around 1990 and kind of ushered in this era of ecosystem management, when the focus was less on timber and more on a suite of conservation values related to things like rare and threatened species. And then some have said, and I'll expand on this in a moment, that since roughly the early 2000s, we may have entered another phase that can be thought of as social forestry, that's characterized by the influence of non-federal, non-agency actors on agency decision-making and planning. And so the final point I would make here, when you look at this sort of very brief history, is that each of these periods came with its own institutions and its own kind of patterns of thinking and behavior. And these all kind of stack on top of one another. And so you can see them here. These are just a few examples, but from its earliest days, the agency had a focus on this sort of bureaucratic independence. Then it added this notion of timber primacy. Then that kind of got complicated with this notion of a multiple use mandate, which then grew into public involvement, external review, this notion of veto points, and then this focus on forest health and collaboration. And I'll expand on this in the slides to come. You know, if we look at the kind of recent changes in national forest governance, there's a lot we could talk about. I personally kind of like this treatment by Georg Winkel, who's actually a German researcher and scholar. And he looked at Forest Service policy change, national forest policy change, driven by the sort of combination of historical, policy, demographic, and discursive factors. And he characterized it as this sort of a competition between these multiple paradigms that I think relate to that slide I just showed. So one of those paradigms being sustained yield, that kind of timber-focused emphasis on kind of scientifically producing the maximum amount of timber. There's still some of that kind of emphasis, some of that paradigm still existing within the agency. Then you have this ecosystem management, as I mentioned, big focus on science, particularly conservation biology. And then those are kind of in competition with this notion of what he called social forestry, which, again, the focus is on collaboration. The focus is on the idea that non-agency stakeholders of various kinds have a lot of influence over agency decision-making and implementation. And so to kind of expand on that idea, one way we might look at this is to think about there being kind of a dominant federal regime for much of the 20th century, where the Forest Service was largely autonomous in its decision-making. There's a focus primarily on timber within that kind of multiple use mandate, where the agency had, adequate budgets to administer those forests while continuing to deal with other issues like fire suppression, and where Congress really played an active role in providing direction and resources to the agency. there were some pressures that started to change that model in the late 20th century, and that had to do with ecological complexity, social complexity, this notion of the proliferation of veto points and veto players, and that a lot of that had to do with that environmental era in the 1970s, the kind of the policies that came out of that era that allowed for more public involvement, allowed for people to challenge government decisions through things like appeals, objections, lawsuits. We also saw a reduction in budgets for the Forest Service at the same time that we were seeing increased expenditures and fire suppression costs. And in many ways, I think we've seen Congress take a backseat to the executive branch and to the courts in setting management direction for the national forests. And so the consequences of those changes, I think we've seen declines in the legitimacy and autonomy of the U.S. Forest Service as an agency. We've seen declines in its capacity, and then we've seen this sort of tension between the formal policy legacy guiding Forest Service management, national forest management, and some of these emergent social and ecological issues that have to do with things like restoration and dealing with fire and other disturbance agents. And so this has led to what you might call that social forestry regime, in the sense that the agency now depends on non-agency entities, stakeholders, partners, et cetera, to provide that legitimacy that's been lost. And a lot of that's happening through collaborative processes of some kind. There's a dependence, an increased dependence upon these partners for increasing the capacity that's been lost. And a lot of that's happening through partnerships. So again, partnerships with, this could be states, counties, tribes, NGOs, et cetera. And then the sort of notion of adaptation happening through these processes of institutional innovation. So these are, you can think of these as kind of pragmatic problem-solving kinds of changes for constructively dealing with these emergent issues that are not well sort of considered by the sort of the dominant policies. So this is kind of the framework I'll be using here, and I think it'll be illustrated in some of the slides to come. So I think to kind of sum up, you could say that the recent changes in national forest governance can be characterized in terms of this shift from a hegemonic agency to a more contested agency. So rather than essentially an autonomous agency with a lot of decision-making authority, we see this greater variety of objectives, a diversification both of the external publics and of the internal staff within the agency, with this proliferation of veto points and veto players that, again, have to do with that kind of wave of environmental legislation in the 1970s that allowed people to be able to challenge federal decision-making. The other side of this is this kind of shift from an autonomous agency to a more networked agency. So you see their available budgets for forest management shrinking, greater reliance on these outside entities for legitimacy, capacity, and innovation that I just talked about, and this greater attention to these kind of cross-scale and cross-boundary issues that are sort of forcing the agency to partner and collaborate more with, again, states, counties, tribes, NGOs, et cetera. So this is sort of one way we might think about these recent changes in governance. And so a lot of the research, I think, that's been done on national forest governance in recent years has really focused on the local scale. It's focused on these collaborative efforts. Obviously, this is a big innovation since the 1990s and the early 2000s. We're seeing a lot of these kind of place-based initiatives that are focused on an alternative to the sort of the conflictual model that was dominant in the 90s. And so we see a lot of studies of these sort of individual places, a real focus on the innovators, on the sort of the best practices, on the what you might think of as the kind of early adopters and innovators in collaboration, as well as looking at some of the tensions that arise through these collaborative efforts. And so there's been some connection to the international literature here on community-based natural resource management, on collaborative governance, and on social ecological system resilience. I think if there's a weakness in that, I think that it's been a great literature and really added a lot to our understanding of national forest governance. If there's a weakness, it may be that it's focused so much on those individual cases and particularly on the innovators, on those early adopters, that it may be missing a little bit of the perspective about what's happening across the national forest system as a whole. And so the kind of what I'm hoping to do here and to illustrate in the research I'll show in a moment is a little bit more of a hybrid complex system approach, where we combine some of those top-down perspectives that I mentioned earlier around kind of the broader macro political, macro institutional changes in the agency with some of those bottom-up perspectives, looking at kind of what's happening with partnerships and collaboration in individual places. I think we need to pay attention to these sort of multiple scales of governance and cross-scale interactions. Obviously, that's a challenging thing to do, but I think hopefully I can illustrate some ways we might think about doing that. And then this attention to emergent dynamics. You know, there's been a criticism of some of the sort of the resilience and community-based natural resource management literature in the sense that it's focused so much on this notion of best practices or design principles, that it may have missed the idea that some of these dynamics, these governance dynamics, may be quite sort of contingent or emergent based on the particularities of individual places. And so I think there's a need to really trace those governance dynamics. So this is, I think, a conceptual model that I really like, and I wasn't part of this research, but these are some of the people that I've worked with, some mentors of mine, Cassandra Mosley and Susan Charnley. And the idea here is this shows, I think, an example of exactly what I was talking about, this mix of the top-down and the bottom-up perspectives, where you have these sort of legal requirements, budgets, performance metrics, et cetera, coming down sort of from the top, from Congress and from the executive branch. And then you have these sort of bottom-up pressures as well, having to do with things like the local communities, the collaboration, the markets, forest product markets, biophysical conditions, the forest types, et cetera. And then we can think about the agency, the decision makers, the district rangers, forest supervisors being kind of caught in the middle and having to make decisions in a way that sort of reconciles these countervailing pressures from different places. So something like this is sort of what I'm going to build on here in a moment. But before I get to the research, I want to sort of briefly talk about this notion of systems thinking, which I don't think has been used enough or adequately in national forest governance research to date, but I think has a lot of promise. Again, I'm going to assume that folks are broadly familiar with this concept, but the idea is it focuses on kind of these causal relationships, these complex causal relationships, this notion of stocks and flows, with a real focus on nonlinearity, emergence, this sort of complex causation, and a real emphasis on feedbacks, these feedback dynamics. And you can see some of those here. This is just a kind of a model from a non-related research paper on acequias in New Mexico. So when we think about these feedbacks, this comes from Donella Meadows' Thinking in Systems book. Again, I'm going to assume folks are broadly familiar with these ideas, but we have the notion of kind of a reinforcing feedback, which is sometimes called a positive feedback loop, which is kind of the short version would be the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, right? That an example might be something like money in an interest-bearing account, where as that money gains interest, you also gain interest on the interest, and so you get this sort of upward sloping curve over time. That's an example of a positive feedback loop. And then the opposite would be a balancing or stabilizing feedback loop, sometimes called a negative feedback loop, where rather than sort of accelerating that velocity or the strength of the feedback, it moderates or diminishes the strength of those feedbacks. And so examples here might be a hot cup of coffee or a cold cup of iced coffee taken out to room temperature. In both cases, they'll start to moderate towards room temperature. So what was getting hotter during the brewing process is now getting colder. What was cold at one point is now getting warmer as it warms up to room temperature. And so I think these sorts of feedback models are important for thinking about some of the dynamics in national forest governance. There's already been some great research and theory in the kind of the political science world, looking at this notion of path dependence, particularly in the sort of the historical institutionalism tradition, looking at how there may be these sort of lock-in effects as decisions are made, and then those decisions sort of reinforce themselves by enrolling actors and institutions and resources under the regime that was already chosen. At the same time, there's some really interesting literature on the opposite, on this notion of path creation, on getting out of those ruts, institutional work, institutional innovation, and this idea that it may not always be the most powerful actors that are kind of moving and shaking these systems. It may not always be the presidents or the elected officials. In some cases, it may be these sort of mid-level actors who understand the system well enough because they're embedded in it, but also have these sort of network connections to outside resources. So some really interesting research there. And so it kind of sets up some interesting questions around where there are these feedbacks in national forest governance processes, as well as where are there opportunities for agency and sort of innovation and path creation. And so again, I think it kind of sets up some interesting research questions for us thinking about where do we see evidence for these patterns. So just to sum up, in terms of the potential contributions of systems thinking, I think there's this notion of we can focus on dynamics rather than just those sort of rules or best practices, those emergent dynamics. I think it gives us an opportunity to trace the influence of power in governance processes, to look at, again, path dependence and path creation, and maybe to do some of that cross-scale tracing of interactions. So I'm going to spend most of the rest of this talk kind of detailing one example of what I hope is a good sort of model for doing some of these things from some recent research on governance responses to the mountain pine beetle epidemic of recent years, the mountain pine beetle outbreak in the Western US. And so this is a native insect, the mountain pine beetle, kind of naturally has these sort of these cycles of outbreak followed by recession. But this most recent outbreak was quite large and sort of in many places historically unprecedented. And so the question we asked here with this research project was, how, if at all, do these governance institutions associated with national forest management, how do they adapt in the face of these environmental change events like the mountain pine beetle outbreak? So as I said, native insect, but with a really huge impact in this most recent outbreak. And this most recent outbreak occurred roughly from about 2000 to about 2015, with sort of different timing in different places across the West. You can see on the map here, this is the mountain pine beetle is the one that's shaded in red. So not only did it affect something like 16 million hectares or more in the US, but an even larger landscape in interior British Columbia. So this was really a massive kind of subcontinental scale disturbance event that was sort of based on some complicated drivers. So it had climate drivers as well as forest structure drivers. So the sort of mix of changes both at the climate level and in terms of forest conditions at the stand all the way up to the landscape scale. And so one of the main sort of research approach I'll be talking about here was a series of case studies we did of different landscapes that were affected by the mountain pine beetle outbreak, this most recent outbreak. And so these were the Black Hills area of South Dakota and Wyoming, northern Colorado. We looked at 3 national forests in northern Colorado, southwestern Montana, and then northeastern Washington. And I'll detail those in a second here. I won't go too deeply into the methods here other than to say that we did a lot of interviews. We talked to about 140 people altogether over a period of 4 years. We also looked at secondary data, sort of plans, EISs, response plans, timber sale data, et cetera. And then we did some targeted historical and archival research. And the idea here is we wanted to look both at what changes might be happening within the formal governance regime for the national forest, which you can see here is this sort of classical hierarchical model that starts at the top with Congress and the executive branch and the federal courts and kind of filters down to that kind of project level decision making at the forest and district scale. But we also wanted to look at the kind of the broader informal network that includes all these other entities like commodity interests, utilities, the counties, states, et cetera, that might add some of these additional resources that I talked about earlier. So all in all, it's a pretty complex scenario. We have a native insect affecting these native tree species in a forest with these past history of forest alterations in terms of structure and processes such as fire. We have these climate drivers. We have a formal hierarchical governance system. We have this informal emergent governance system with all these cross-scalar and social ecological feedback. So it's a pretty daunting task in some way to take this on and try to trace these governance processes, but that's what we did here. So before I get into the case study results, I want to mention that we did also look to see, was there a formal policy response to this mountain pine beetle outbreak? And so we looked at legislation introduced into and passed by Congress as far back as we could go that specifically mentioned the mountain pine beetle as an insect. And I would say we found pretty limited evidence of a congressional response. There were certainly plenty of bills introduced into Congress. Only a few of them were ever passed into law. And of the 3 that have been passed since this most recent outbreak started, 2 were very specific, very kind of constrained in their scope. One was specific to the Black Hills National Forest, and I'll talk about that in a second. And another was specific to National Forest in California. The more substantive one was actually the Healthy Forest Restoration Act in 2003, which was primarily a fire-focused bill, but it did include a whole section on responding to insect emergencies as well. But I would say overall the sort of legislative response was pretty modest. And so I think, naturally looked to see, was there some sort of adaptation or response at these regional to local scales that wasn't reflected so much at the national level. So what I'm going to do here is to briefly explain the kind of the simple version of the causal model that we developed here, and then talk about how it applied to each of the 4 case studies that we did. So the idea here, kind of going back to that Moseley and Charnley model, that we know that these sort of biophysical variables matter, and that certainly came through in our research. So things like how accessible is the terrain, how valuable is the standing timber, these are going to affect management responses, because it costs money to lay out timber sales and to build roads and administer and all that. And so depending on how much you're getting from the timber, you may be able to offset that, or you may not. And so this, I think, economically is important. And that certainly came through in our studies. At the same time, the landscape may include elements that are important from more of a political and social perspective. So if there's roadless areas, let's say, or endangered species, that could affect some of the social processes around how these networks evolved and emerged to confront this mountain pine beetle outbreak. In several cases, we saw some kind of targeted intervention by these higher level actors. So again, these could be senators, congresspeople, members of the executive branch, essentially someone in a position of power that specifically intervened in a particular landscape to help deal with the response there. There's a whole suite of these new formal policy tools, including things like the Healthy Forest Restoration Act, but also the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, Good Neighbor Authority, Joint Chiefs Landscape Restoration Partnership, as well as some new categorical exclusions from full NEPA analysis. So these are the sorts of things, some tools in the Farm Bill that were potentially influential here, and those emerged through our research. And then we have this notion of the veto opportunities. I've already alluded to those, the idea that people and entities, organizations can essentially challenge federal decisions. And when they do, that can kind of complicate decision-making, right? Can potentially slow down the process. In other cases, it may improve the process. It kind of depends on your perspective. I mentioned legitimacy building via these deliberative processes, this notion of collaboration that I talked about earlier, this notion of building capacity to plan and implement some kind of intervention on the landscape. And these are, of course, we're looking at silvicultural interventions because this is what we expect to see from the Forest Service, right? That there'd be some kind of response, either in terms of thinning, commercial timber harvest, salvage logging, something that essentially manipulates the forest in a way that is intended to respond to the mountain pine beetle threat or an already infested forest. And then I talked about that notion of engagement in some kind of innovation, the sort of pragmatic problem solving. The idea here is that there's all these sort of causal connections between these, right? So you can see that the red arrows here are the negative relationships. So we would think that we found, I should say, that the use of veto opportunities reduce the ability to build that agreement, that legitimacy, reduce the ability to kind of creatively innovate. You see the blue arrows here, the positive feedback. So we would see that the legitimacy building, the capacity, the innovation all kind of fed off of each other in a kind of a virtuous cycle. And so that's what you see here with this notion of a reinforcing feedback loop. And then on the opposite side, a balancing or stabilizing feedback loop. And then there's all kinds of other causal relationships between these variables, right? Like we might see that that targeted intervention by these higher level actors may have reduced the ability to use those veto opportunities, or the presence of controversial landscape elements may have encouraged more of that use of veto opportunities. Accessibility of terrain and value of standing timber obviously increases the ability to implement these silvicultural interventions because, like I said, there's money to pay for it then. And so there's these sort of two very broad feedback loops we might pay attention to. One is, again, this positive loop with legitimacy, capacity, and innovation all kind of building off one another. And the second being this sort of stabilizing feedback loop where a lack of legitimacy, limited capacity, and these constraints on innovation all kind of created its own cycle. So what I'm going to do here is sort of walk through examples from each of our 4 cases that showed how these dynamics played out. So I'm going to start with the Colorado case. This was the White River, Arapaho-Roosevelt, and Medicine Bow Route National Forest. So these are the 3 forests that were hit really hard by the mountain pine beetle in Colorado. A big sort of lodgepole pine belt there that was almost entirely wiped out by the pine beetle. And so prior to the outbreak, I think we mostly saw this sort of balancing feedback loop where there wasn't a lot of silvicultural activity going on. And that's not surprising. This is Colorado. It's a big recreation economy. You have these fairly steep mountain landscapes where it's tough to get to the timber anyway. And so the pressure was really to focus on recreation. When the pine beetle hit, there was a big focus on this notion of legitimacy building. So the Colorado Bark Beetle Cooperative was created that included county governments, NGOs, state government, the small amount of wood products sector that existed in Colorado, and really helped to build agreement around a response plan that could be broadly supported by all these different elements. Once that kind of agreement was in place, they were able to take that to the Washington level and get support from these higher level actors. In this case, both members of Congress, but also members of the essentially the executive agencies, Interior and Agriculture, who funneled money specifically to deal with these dilemmas in Colorado, kind of along the lines of the plan that was built by this collaborative group. And so that kind of influx of money created this capacity to plan that maybe wasn't there before. It allowed for some investments in wood processing infrastructure. There's a big focus on engaging in innovation, so a lot of pragmatic problem solving. Again, the policies driving national forest management were mostly not set up to deal with dilemmas like this one. And so there's a lot of sort of how do we work around these policy barriers. The focus here was really on salvage in Colorado. The mountain pine beetle hit really fast and really hard, and so the state was left with all these dead forests in places where people like to recreate, so ski areas, trails, roads, et cetera. And so the focus was really on those places plus the utility corridors. They did use some of these new formal policy tools, things like stewardship contracting and the Good Neighbor Authority. And for a time, it really did lead to this sort of classic, what you might think of as a virtuous cycle, this positive feedback loop. But I think ultimately this notion of the fact that there wasn't much milling capacity, the timber was not worth much, especially after a few years, and the terrain was pretty inaccessible. All those things combined meant that there wasn't really much of an economic driver to continue this sort of work after that initial pulse of funding was spent. And so they kind of went back to the status quo ante once that money was spent. So if we look at the Black Hills National Forest, we see a different set of dynamics. Again, starting off before the beetle outbreak, there was a lot of conflict. There were some appeals and lawsuits over the forest plan revision, the Black Hills Forest Plan revision. Again, we saw some targeted intervention by these higher level actors. In this case, it was Senator Tom Daschle, who held a very powerful position at that time. I think he was I'm not sure, the majority leader or minority leader in the Senate. I believe he was majority leader at that point, who basically put in a specific language to the Black Hills National Forest saying, we're going to say that this plan and these response, these pine beetle response efforts are sufficient and no one can sue over them anymore. And so that kind of allowed some of these projects to move forward in spite of these veto challenges. So kind of eliminated some of those opportunities. At the same time, Daschle's office helped to kind of convene a lot of the major players for some of these collaborative processes, There's several sort of these partnerships and collaborative processes built in the Black Hills. This is an area that already had a large timber industry, a lot of mills, a lot of ability to add value to timber that was removed. The terrain is relatively accessible, very highly eroded, and the timber is relatively valuable. A lot of ponderosa pine in this area. And so you had this sort of, again, this classic virtuous cycle, a lot of engagement and innovation. So the kind of virtuous cycle spun, and some would say, some of our interviewees said that it may have actually spun too much or too fast, because there were many who felt that the forest cut so hard in trying to deal with the mountain pine beetle dilemma that they may have actually put their future timber supplies in jeopardy, and including putting some of the mills, the local mills, in jeopardy in terms of having enough supply for future years. If we move on to the Colville National Forest, this is our case study in Washington. This is a forest that was already doing a lot of collaborative processes, building that kind of legitimacy in that agreement prior to the mountain pine beetle ever kind of coming onto the scene in the first place. This is another place that had a lot of capacity in terms of both the Forest Service's capacity, but also in terms of mill capacity, a lot of different mills in this area. A lot of innovation. I would say the Colville National Forest for a while there, and maybe still is the case, that anytime there's a new policy that came on the scene, they're an early adopter, one of the first forests to try out things like stewardship contracting, the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, Tribal Forest Protection Act, et cetera. Any sort of new policy tended to get adopted pretty quickly on the Colville. And a lot of that had to do with the agreement and the legitimacy that was built there around essentially a vision of this sort of landscape scale restoration. And so this is another place where we saw this sort of virtuous cycle between the legitimacy, capacity, and the innovation. But this was something that was already in place prior to the mountain pine beetle outbreak. Once the pine beetle showed up, not a lot really changed. They just kind of incorporated those concerns into their ongoing kind of landscape scale restoration agenda. And again, this is another place where that accessibility of the terrain, the value of the standing timber, and the mill capacity really helped to support those efforts. At the same time, unlike in the Black Hills, there were some controversial landscape elements, some roadless areas that conservation organizations wanted to see protected as wilderness. You had some endangered species like the Canada lynx. Yet I think the collaborative group, in this case, the Northeast Washington Forestry Coalition, was able to essentially focus their attention and their energies on the less controversial parts of the landscape, and that allowed them to get a lot of work done. Finally, I'll talk about the Montana cases. These were the Beaverhead-Deerlodge and the Helena-Lewis and Clark National Forests in southwestern Montana. This is a place where there was a lot of conflict prior to the pine beetle ever breaking out. And a lot of that has to do with these controversial landscape elements. So roadless areas and endangered species, not just Canada lynx, but also things like grizzly bear in this case. So a lot of veto opportunities, a lot of very sort of confrontational, conflictual environmental groups based right in the sort of the backyard of these national forests. They felt like this was their sort of home turf. And so it became very difficult, I think, to break out of some of those cycles. So you had this sort of a classic kind of balancing cycle that I mentioned earlier. There was some hope in potentially getting intervention from higher level actors. In this case, there was actually a bill drafted that would have codified a compromise between environmental and wood products interests on some of these national forests that would have allowed certain kind of programs of work to move forward. That bill never became law, and so that sort of intervention by higher level actors didn't really come to pass. There was some use of these new formal policy tools in Montana, particularly those categorical exclusions from NEPA that I mentioned. The downside, and those did reduce the use of veto opportunities in places. The downside to using those is that they're very limited in their spatial scale. So they're really for relatively small areas. So you contrast that with something like the Black Hills National Forest. The Black Hills actually didn't use a lot of these new formal policy tools. They sort of used the old policies in innovative ways. So for example, they would do a single NEPA analysis for a project at the scale of the entire national forest. So that's something they were able to do because they essentially were able to build that agreement and to some extent eliminate some of those vetoes. That was not the case in Montana. And so the formal policy tools they used were somewhat limited in their scope. This is another place where the terrain was relatively accessible in many cases. You had some valuable standing timber, you had mill capacity, but in general, in responding to the mountain pine beetle, the veto sort of influence really reigned supreme. So that's just sort of a big kind of quick overview of some of those governance dynamics in those 4 forests. So kind of stepping back and sort of looking at the big picture, I think we would say that we found some evidence that governance was transformed as a result of the outbreak. And I think the clearest example came from the Black Hills, where you really had that higher level intervention that I mentioned from Senator Daschle. Again, some people, some of our interviewees in that case actually felt that even though it worked in a sense, it may have worked too well and maybe allowed that cycle to spin out of control. Our other cases, we didn't see as much change, or the change was temporary. So in Colorado, for example, we saw kind of a temporary change that then went back once the money was spent. In Montana, we didn't see much change out of that sort of conflictual status quo. And then in Washington, we didn't see much change out of that sort of more high functioning kind of creative collaborative status quo. I would caution to say that I think when we look at these sort of governance patterns, I think our temptation is often to pin it on the individual people, to say that there's a difference between the managers or the key network participants in the more successful quote unquote cases versus the less successful quote unquote cases. I actually would disagree with that. I think the people in places like Montana were just as creative and just as innovative as the people in Washington, let's say. There were just some kind of structural differences, some of these sort of differences that only came out if you look at that kind of governance scenario as a whole, that help explain why it was so much harder to get some things done in Montana than it was, let's say, in Washington. And again, there's some contingent elements here. Had that bill that I mentioned in Montana passed, they may be in a very different situation, or they may have been in a very different situation. I think, again, this notion of looking at those feedback processes is an important insight of this research. So kind of wrapping up with some conclusions, I would really highlight this idea that even though we can talk about this broad sweep of changes across the national forest system as a whole, kind of at a more local scale, at a forest or regional scale, I think we're seeing these complex, emergent, cross-scalar dynamics at play. So even forests that are relatively close to one another spatially may show some pretty different outcomes because of these differences. But I don't think those differences are chaotic. So I think there are probably some drivers here, like some of those that I mentioned or identified in the research, that may be present, that may help explain why some of these governance outcomes are diverging so much. And so I think that's really the benefit of a systems approach, to illuminate those drivers, illuminate those patterns, those sort of causal relationships that might otherwise not be obvious. But to do so, at least from our experience, and my experience, it's a big investment of time. It requires a really sustained inquiry, this kind of thing that can only be done through an in-depth case study. And again, you know, we had multiple people working on this project, interviewed 140 people and spent 4 years doing it. It's obviously a heavy lift, but I think it shows the kind of insights you can derive from that kind of investment of time and resources. So I'll wrap it up there and leave time for questions and discussions. I obviously want to thank my colleagues on this project and our funding source from the NSF, and invite people to ask questions now or to follow up later. Here's my email, and I'll go ahead and stop sharing this so we can go back to the main panel, and then I'll look at your questions in the chat. So thanks, everyone.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much, Jesse. That's a round of applause you're hearing from everybody. So, folks, time for questions.
Okay, so
go ahead,
we have
Jesse.
the first question here from Akihiro Koyama, who asks, I'm curious how the current large wildfires will affect the dynamics. Yeah, great question. And I probably should have pointed out that when we looked at the mountain pine beetle responses, I certainly don't want to imply that the mountain pine beetle exists in some kind of a political, ecological vacuum, right, where people can only focus on one thing at a time. Obviously, all these forests we looked at also were dealing with fires, large fires in recent years. I mean, all of them. I mean, the Black Hills, the Colville, the Southwest Montana forests in particular. And so a lot of these new policy tools that I mentioned I think, are as much about responding to the fire threat as they're about responding to things like the sort of insect outbreaks. So in other words, when you look at policies like the Healthy Forest Restoration Act and these other policies that have come along since then, they tend to share, I think, a common paradigm. And that paradigm is rather than sort of the older forest policies that might have said, here's your marching orders, here's what you're supposed to do. These newer policies say, here's an optional tool you can use if you feel it's appropriate. And if you choose to use it, here's some of the benefits you get from it. Like maybe it reduces the required analysis under NEPA, or it reduces the ability of outside actors to contest, right, to use those veto levers, et cetera. And so I think my sense is that the current wildfires, and we've seen these obviously devastating wildfires in places like California and Oregon and Washington. My sense is, if anything, they're probably going to continue to sort of push policies that are in that same vein. So I know there's some bills that are under consideration right now. I think Dianne Feinstein's been quite involved in one of those that would essentially do some of these same things. It would say, okay, for certain types of projects that are broadly focused on restoration and fire risk reduction, we're going to provide some expedited processes that might reduce the NEPA obligations, reduce the ability of veto actors to contest those actions. But if you choose to adopt this tool, you have to kind of abide by certain principles that have to do with, this should actually be about fuel reduction and fire risk reduction and not be used for maybe some other purposes. So that's my sense of how the kind of current fire year is likely to affect sort of this forest policy and governance moving forward. Okay, so next question. Does your work, from Richard Kobe, does your work suggest best practices for effective forest governance, however effective might be defined? Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a tough question. And I think in part it's tough because that notion of how do we define effective, right? You know, I think as a researcher, as a social scientist, my sort of temptation is to always say, I'm here to sort of explain and observe and analyze, but not to take sides or to say one's better than another. And so I think, for example, if you were to talk to some of the veto actors in a place like Montana, they would probably say, we got the best outcome that we could have possibly gotten, which is, you know, we stopped the Forest Service from going in and doing a bunch of cutting of large trees in a roadless area or something. Of course, other people would give you a very different opinion on that same outcome. And so obviously effective is itself a tough concept to define. I think certainly when you look at a disturbance regime as complex as the mountain pine beetle, I think that the idea here is that in some ways this was an issue or a disturbance event that was set up over probably decades of fire suppression, of past timber practices, of climate drivers, and we were trying to respond to it within a period of a year or a couple of years, right? And so there's a mismatch there where I think, you know, that we can't respond to these things that sort of build up over decades with a short-term response. To me personally, if I had to choose, I would say the most effective kind of model might be the Washington model, in the sense that they've been kind of working on restoration with kind of integrated economic development at a landscape scale for many years on the Colville National Forest. And so they didn't have to suddenly try to lurch to change their practices when the mountain pine beetle came along. And so that, I think it took an investment. It took a long-term investment of people's energy into these collaborative processes. I think it took a lot of trust building. I think the fact that one of the main sort of mill operators in that area is sort of an innovative family-owned business, the Vaughan brothers. I think that actually helped the collaborative process. I think it helped build some of the trust with particularly the conservation organizations that might have had a harder time kind of building that trust with some of the larger multinational corporations. So I think that's an example of some of those kind of very contingent place-based details. But I think best practices probably are going to have to do with taking that longer-term view. So rather than sort of lurching to respond to whatever the crisis is at the moment, to have kind of build a long-term vision that people can agree upon, and sort of work at large scales to sort of consistently to meet that vision. To me, that's much more effective because it builds the investments in the infrastructure, it builds the investments in the relationship, and it kind of provides a lot of tools when something like this comes along versus, let's say, Colorado, which tried to suddenly build a timber industry where it never had one before. And you can imagine that that didn't work out very well. So let's see, I'll go to the next question here from David Lewis, from David, hi. You mentioned systems thinking and systems dynamics, such as feedback loops. You focus on directionality, such as positive and negative. Do you see a mechanism that accounts for rates, as in response or action taking, and if there are various varying factors there? So in other words, if I'm understanding the question correctly, we don't just want to look at directionality and positive or negative. There's this whole kind of question of strength and influence of these connections. And yeah, absolutely. So I think, for example, we saw examples of, let's say, the veto activation in all 4 cases, but the strength was so much greater in the Montana case than it was in some of the 3 other cases. And so in some ways that sort of causal model was just an attempt to do a very basic, simple, nuts and bolts outline of what some of the main relationships were. But I think the idea here is what we really want to do is exactly what you said, trace the details, trace those detailed interactions. How important is this in a particular case? How does it interact with these other factors? And so I think that's sort of where you get some of those emergent dynamics that I mentioned, not just in terms of that structure of what does this causal model look like, but what are some of those very specific details. And I think this is where you get these interesting questions of contingency, where really this is where I think a single person can make a difference, but maybe not in the way we normally think, which is to say a certain person at a certain sort of the right time in the right place in that system can really create a change just by some contingent factor, right? Like I said, having a family-owned mill versus a more kind of sort of multinationally owned mill, that something like that might have made a difference, where the boxes and arrows are still the same, but there's just a kind of a strength in the directionality there. So, and then let's see, I'll go to Larry Leifer's question. Keith Reynolds and others have worked on the ecosystem management, DSS, decision support system. This has been used in many ways to quantify decision-making within the Forest Service. It provides quantitative assessments based on qualitative information. Can you elaborate on how your analysis is done? Yeah, so thanks for that question. I'll say that the larger NSF project of which the study comes out, what was really designed to do something like, I think, what you're saying, and I'm not familiar with the DSS that you referenced there, but it sounds very interesting. So I'll definitely take a look at that. The idea here was to combine kind of qualitative inquiry on governance dynamics with an agent-based model. And so that agent-based model, I would say, is still under development, even though the project itself has concluded. But the idea behind these case studies was not just to generally provide insights or kind of results and conclusions about what's happening with forest governance, but specifically to feed into something that sounds like you're talking about. So the idea here would be coming up with some guidelines, some empirical kind of basis for saying, in these sorts of situations, here's some of the different responses, here's some of the relationships between different players, here's some of the dynamics under different policy regimes, and then to be able to sort of model those. Again, not to do anything predictive, not to say, therefore, under a future scenario, we ought to do X, but rather as a way, I think, of exploring different scenarios and thinking about how much might change if we changed a policy in a certain way, or if we added or subtracted the strength of certain actors in the scenario. So as I said, we're still working on that, and it's still under development, but I think there are some really interesting possibilities here for taking some of these findings from something like a kind of a qualitative approach and turning them into things like rules or scenarios or kind of parameters for informing something like an agent-based model. And so that's about as much as I can say, other than that kind of since the beginning, myself and my colleagues have been working with, within our group, including agent-based modelers, to think about how might we set up these studies specifically to inform the development of these agent-based models. And so that's a conversation that's still ongoing, but but I think we've gotten to the point where we started to think about rules and resources and how we might structure this, kind of based on, again, a combination of original research, but also literature that's already out there. All right, and then we got a new question from Evan Svaranosi. Sorry if hope I pronounced that right. Thanks for the talk. You mentioned that some interviewees thought the positive feedback loop was potentially working too well in the Black Hills. How would the removal of salvage wood affect future woodability in that market? Obviously, it's likely to have a decrease in near future timber supply due to the mountain pine beetle outbreak and immediate salvage, but wouldn't that age class distribution issue have occurred regardless? The value of the salvage wood is time dependent. Yes, and I thank you for bringing that up, because you made me realize I neglected an important detail here, which is the forests were somewhat different in how they handled their timber response. So as I said, in Colorado, it was almost entirely a salvage operation, and that really had to do with the fear of dead trees falling on power lines and people's homes and mountain bikers and things like that. That was not the case in some of the other places we looked. And so in the Black Hills, for example, the focus was very much on green trees. They said, we're really not going to try to clean up behind the beetle. What we're going to try to do is get ahead of the beetle. And so one of the reasons they did that big sort of forest-wide EIS, NEPA document that I mentioned, was specifically so they could move quickly to treat places that look to be under threat or under attack by the pine beetle. And so it was really very much a live tree focused response rather than a salvage focused response. And so I think that kind of does touch on the point that that this wasn't necessarily just about salvage, but really about kind of the green timber program. And then David has a question here, which might be the last one, because I see we're about out of time.
Yes.
So yes, where I work, governance is a polite way to say no corruption. How would your framework work in that governance environment, understanding corruption, its controls and drivers? That's a great question too. And I would actually say you actually touched on something that I would like to explore, which is to look at how some of these same mid to regional scale kind of emergent dynamics might explain environmental governance in other kind of institutional settings. And so, for example, I've done a little bit of work in Argentina. My wife's from Argentina, and so I'm down there quite often. They have a very interesting native forest law that, because Argentina is a federalized country, they leave it up to the provinces to essentially implement this law. And so you see very different implementation of the forest law across these different provinces. So I think that would be an example of a situation where you might be able to take some of these same ideas and apply them and say, yeah, why is it that one province seems to do a really good job implementing this law, and another place it seems to be falling apart? And I imagine that corruption would have to be a part of the answer in a place like Argentina, as it would in much of the world, right? And so I agree. I think this notion of governance certainly has multiple meanings, but I think that the general approach may be transferable to other contexts. So I see we're at 4:30, so I'm going to wrap it up there. And I don't know, David, if there's any kind of final comments from you.
No, that's excellent presentation, Jesse. Thank you so much for doing that. I found it very interesting, and for some of the reasons that I did mention, because governance is a huge part of the RED Plus agenda.
Mm-hmm.
Forest governance is critical. So. Great talk, and I think we all appreciate it. And I just want to remind everyone that we'll have another seminar in the Hanover series coming up. So watch your calendars and tune in next week this time. So again, thanks, Jesse.
Absolutely.
Hope to see you around sometime when we can talk in person. All right.
I would love to do that.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye, everyone. Thank you.